We're beginning this morning with a story about the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant is basically a huge ornate box, and this box will eventually become part of the Jewish temple, and it's in the place where God is said to sit. And it has images of angels on top of it and big poles that you use to pick up and carry it. And the Ark of the Covenant contains four things. It contains the two tablets that Moses was given with the Ten Commandments on them. It contains the staff that belonged to Moses' brother Aaron. And it contains a jar of manna, which is the holy food that God gave to the Jewish people as they wandered the desert. And so the Ark of the Covenant is this symbol. It's a symbol of the power and the traditions of the Jewish people. And in biblical stories, it gets stolen and moved around a lot, right? It's kind of the ultimate biblical MacGuffin. Now in the year 2020, there are several religious communities, all over the world who claim that they are in possession of the real Ark of the Covenant. If you ever feel like falling down a rabbit hole of internet conspiracy theories, might I strongly suggest all of the people talking about where the Ark of the Covenant is. So in our story, the Jewish people, led by King David, have just recovered the Ark of the Covenant after it was stolen by another group, and they put the Ark in the back of a cart pulled by two oxen, and they march back to Jerusalem, dancing and celebrating the whole way. But then the Ark, sitting there on the ox cart, it starts to wobble a little bit, right? Kind of as if maybe the oxen hit a bump or a hole in the road, and so the Ark starts to kind of sway back and forth, and this guy named Uzzah sees this happening, and he reaches out his hand to try and steady the Ark, right? But immediately when he touches the Ark, he's struck down by God. He's killed. He's utterly destroyed because the Ark of the Covenant is too sacred for a mortal person to touch. The story is traditionally interpreted as being, kind of a story about how you shouldn't reach above your station, right? People might say that Uzzah, that he was unworthy to touch the Ark, or, maybe, that it was blasphemous of him to believe that the sacred Ark of God needed him to steady it. But I see this more as being a story about what happens when a structure that was built for one specific time attempts to continue to exist in a different time. The story begins with the Ark of the Covenant being placed into a cart, but the Ark of the Covenant was not designed for a cart, right? The Ark was always intended to be carried on poles by people. So it was put in this cart to wobble around, presumably because nobody was willing to carry the Ark all the way back to Jerusalem. And that's interesting, right? Because for years and years, it just went without saying that this object, this institution, the unquestionably sacred and noble Ark of the Covenant, had to be carried on the backs of human beings, whether they liked it or not. And yet, that's not what happens in this story. In the story, the Ark gets put on the back of the cart, and everybody just kind of assumes that the Ark is going to be able to adapt to a new way of doing things. But the Ark has trouble. This ancient structure that is full of ideas and relics from a bygone era cannot, it turns out, easily transition into a new era in which people are starting to question whether or not they are willing to carry this big, heavy ark around. So even as the people around it are dancing and celebrating like nothing is wrong, the old institution starts to rattle and shift uncomfortably, because try as the people might, dance though the people may, the Ark of the Covenant simply wasn't built for this. And so much of what I see happening in our society at the moment, it looks like that same kind of shifting. These past few weeks, we have seen marches and demonstrations happening all over our country and all over our world in response to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black people who have been killed by American police officers. These protests have asked all of us to rethink the role that law enforcement plays in our lives and in our communities, and I know this is where I risk losing some of you, right, who will turn off the sermon now and then send me an email asking why I had to get so political. And my response, which I'll just give you now, is that I don't see this as getting political at all. Because when there is a movement that is asserting that Black lives matter, and people are pushing back against that movement, that is a situation that people of faith need to pay close attention to, right? Because the question of whether or not human life has value, that is not only a political question, I would say that is first and foremost a religious question. Our first principle of Unitarian Universalism states that we affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So allying ourselves with the Black Lives Matter movement is an expression of the first tenet of our faith. And it's also an expression of our faith to join the conversation about what role the American criminal justice system plays in our society. Especially if that system seems to value its own existence over the lives and safety of innocent human beings. As this movement has gone on, we have seen the system react in ways that violent systems tend to react when they are challenged by people who say, "We aren't going to carry you anymore. We're going to need you to adjust and keep steady." The protests that have happened as a part of this movement have been almost entirely peaceful, and yet we have seen protesters getting attacked by people in combat armor with weapons and vehicles and tear gas, and that is not to say that every individual police officer is hateful or violent. I have known and worked with and ministered to many fabulous police officers and corrections officers. But it is to say that our country has a long and gruesome history of people in positions of legal authority using that authority to attack and destroy the bodies and lives of oppressed people, particularly Black and brown people. And part of what we are seeing now is a manifestation of that legacy. We're seeing a symptom of what can happen when human beings work within a structure that gives them a huge amount of power and very little in the way of consequences for abusing that power. The great theologian Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that goodness, armed with power, is always corrupted. And look, I'm a clergy person, right? There was a time when clergy people had a huge amount of power. And many of us were good people, and some of us used that huge amount of power to have people excommunicated and burned at the stake. And so now the role of clergy in our society has had to change. One of the ways in which people responded to the misuse of power by religious leaders was the founding of this very religion. And so now, in many corners of our society, law enforcement professionals are looked at as being so full of goodness, so sacred that nobody dares to question their authority or judgment, just like clergy once were. And so in both cases, the institutions that support people who do this work need to be reimagined in ways that truly do not allow them to take or destroy innocent people and their lives. And to be clear, this is not about total lawlessness, right? When people talk about defunding or reimagining our law enforcement system, that doesn't mean complete anarchy. It doesn't mean no police. Just like the Protestant Reformation doesn't mean no more ministers. It means reimagining the system within which those people work, so that the system functions in a way that is truly equal and fair for everyone, including them. And it can be easy in situations like this one for people, especially people who are white and privileged, like I am. It can be easy to say, do we really need to change the whole thing? Or we start to think like Uzzah. Right, we start to think maybe all that needs to happen is that I can just reach over and just adjust it a little bit, and then everything will be okay. And I think Uzzah is acting from a place of genuine concern. He reaches out to catch and steady the ark because he is aware of what the ark means to the Jewish people, and he is worried about what would happen if the ark was broken or lost because the contents are so important and good, and he is trying to fix the problem. So he reaches out to steady the ark, and the ark reacts by destroying him, not because he is somehow unworthy, but because when we have structures that exist on the pretense that they are untouchable and that enforce that untouchability with violence, and we ask those old structures to exist in ways that cause less oppression and harm, when we ask them to exist in a way that does not require their weight to be carried on the broken backs of human beings, when those structures are put into a new situation and people start trying to reach out to adjust them to work in a new way, they respond with violence because that is how they were built to function. The Ark of the Covenant is just doing what the Ark of the Covenant does. So what do we do then? How do people of faith respond to the situation that we are in? I want to tell you all this story. I love this story. This is a story out of the Talmud. The Talmud is an ancient book of Jewish laws. And also in the Talmud, there's Jewish laws, and there's opinions from many different rabbis about how to interpret those laws, and stories that give examples of how people might live into those laws. Since the beginning of social distancing, I've been studying Talmud and poetry every week over Zoom with my friend Rabbi Feivel Strauss. And Feivel and I have just gotten to this part of the Talmud where the rabbis are having this really interesting conversation about the circumstances under which it is okay to demolish a synagogue. And generally speaking, the rule seems to be that you can demolish a synagogue only when a new synagogue has been fully built to replace it. And they specify it doesn't matter if you've raised the money to build the new synagogue already, and somebody says, What if you've already purchased the materials to build the new synagogue? And no, you cannot tear down the old synagogue until the new one is built. But this all comes with a really interesting caveat, because in the Talmud, I am learning there is almost always a caveat. And the caveat comes when they talk about what to do if your synagogue has cracks in it. Right, well, one of the rabbis explains that if there are cracks in the synagogue, the building needs to be demolished right away. And tells this amazing story about a rabbi named Rav Ashi. And in the story, Rav Ashi notices that his temple has cracks in the walls, and so he immediately has it destroyed. But then Rav Ashi does something pretty amazing. He takes his bed out of his house, and he moves it to the construction site where the new temple is being built. Right, because it was so important that the new temple be built as quickly and as well as possible that Rav Ashi made sure that he wouldn't be able to sleep comfortably until the task was completed. So when I think about our role as people of faith in the ongoing struggle for justice, our role is to proclaim loudly and clearly, wherever and whenever we can, that Black lives matter, that we will not stand idly by while violence is visited upon innocent people, and to proclaim that if an institution is so full of cracks, if the temple, the vessel that exists to teach and personify goodness in this world, if that structure has so many cracks in its walls and in its roof and in its foundation that not everybody inside is protected in the way that they need to be, then our job is not to sit around and think that maybe someday we'll build something else. Our job is not to just assume that maybe somebody will reach over and make some adjustments to steady everything out, even though if they do that, they will be destroyed for trying while we dance and celebrate. Our job is to say, no, this thing no longer works. And in fact, the only way that it ever worked was by protecting some people and exposing others to serious harm. And we are going to need to figure out how to build something better. And we need to do this with the understanding that the people who were most affected by the flaws in the old structure, the people who were forced to carry around the old structure on their backs, the people who got rained on and snowed on because the old structure had cracks in the roof and in the walls, we must support those people in leading the way towards envisioning a new structure, because they are the ones who understand exactly how the old structure was broken. And until that new structure is built, it is incumbent upon all of us to move our beds to the construction site, to shift our lives around to the point where we won't be able to sleep or rest comfortably until there is a temple built that is able to cover and protect everyone equally. And those structures can be built. Because the thing is, the Ark of the Covenant is gone, right? There are different people who claim to have it, but there is no definitive proof from any of them, and how could there be? If the Ark of the Covenant ever actually existed, it is almost certainly now lost to history. The structure that was once so sacred and untouchable that you couldn't adjust its position on a cart without being struck down, it is now gone. And the world has moved forward and even thrived without it, because we have access to what it really contained. We have what made it matter so much. Right, the tablets of the Ten Commandments, really represented structure and covenant. Aaron's staff represents support and balance. Jars of manna from heaven represent the sustenance of unconditional love. So what the Ark of the Covenant really contained was the underpinnings to a just and equal community. It contained the ingredients for a just and equal community. The problem arose when somebody tried to preserve those ideals in a structure that caused people harm. So when we see the ark starting to wobble, the answer is not to try and adjust it a little bit. The answer is to let it fall, to let it break open, to preserve the love and care that are contained within. I am not sure if the temple that was built in the place where Rav Ashi made his bed is still standing. But plenty of temples and religious places and important institutions and objects have come and gone since then. And that is not a bad thing. Our job as people of faith is to always be thinking about a new temple, about a new structure, a new container for the faith of our community, and to move our beds to the place where it is being built, and to work together and not rest until a temple has been constructed that can shelter and care for us all. Amen.